this relationship and this visit also has to be seen against a broader geopolitical context, both regionally and globally. Because Russia is engaging with multiple partners, India is engaging with multiple partners. So our respective engagements with these third countries is having some kind of an impact on the bilateral relationship itself. So if Russia, for example, has its problems with the United States and Europe today, has a very close relationship with China. Similarly, India's relationship with the United States and the West today is probably the best it has ever been. Whereas
Yeah.
we have major tensions and difficulties with China. So the interplay of these kind of conflicting and overlapping relationships on the bilateral relationship is also very much part of the backdrop of the visit.
For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. Good evening, I'm Surya Gangadharan and welcome to the first Gist of the new year in 2024. We're looking at External Affairs Minister Jaishankar's visit to Moscow last week. By all accounts, it went well. The optics were good. He even called on President Putin, something which rarely happens to other foreign ministers. So I have with me Mr. Pankaj Saran, a former Deputy National Security Advisor, former Ambassador to Moscow, and he's also head of the Natstrat think tank in Delhi. Ambassador Saran, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Surya, and wish you a very happy new year. Best wishes for 2024.
Thank you, and the very same to you, sir. So, when we look at Jaishankar's visit to Russia, uh, were the takeaways more geopolitical in nature, or would you see it as something much broader?
No, I think it was a mixture of many things. Firstly, it was very much part and parcel of the high level contacts that we've always had with Russia. So, in that sense, it was expected and it was a due visit. It was not extraordinary in that sense. Secondly, it had a political component and also an economic component because he co-chairs the Intergovernmental Commission on Economic and Trade and Scientific Cooperation with the Deputy Prime Minister in Russia. So that actually deals with the economic, trade, finance, investment agenda. And his talks with the Foreign Minister Lavrov were presumably focused largely on the political and geopolitical and security aspects. But today what has happened is for many, many reasons, the India-Russia relationship, it always had its bilateral kind of elements and bilateral compulsions. But increasingly, this relationship and this visit also has to be seen against a broader geopolitical context, both regionally and globally. Because Russia is engaging with multiple partners, India is engaging with multiple partners. So our respective engagements with these third countries is having some kind of an impact on the bilateral relationship itself. So if Russia, for example, has its problems with the United States and Europe today, has a very close relationship with China. Similarly, India's relationship with the United States and the West today is probably the best it has ever been. Whereas
Yeah.
we have major tensions and difficulties with China. So the interplay of these kind of conflicting and overlapping relationships on the bilateral relationship is also very much part of the backdrop of the visit.
Mhm. So let's look at the political. You mentioned that Ukraine. On the ground, it does appear that Putin has the upper hand, and there is a sense of increasing fatigue in the West about supporting this war. What is your sense, and where does it help us?
Yeah, I think on the ground, obviously now it's the winter, so an active military battle is much less than it would be, presumably, after the snows melt in the summer. But if you look at the whole picture, say, of the last 2 years, I think on the ground, the Russians seem to have territorially achieved whatever they would have wanted to prior to the military action. So, in terms of territorial gain, it seems that they have fulfilled their military objectives. Number one. Number two, in terms of the strategic aspects and the costs of such gains, these are heavy for both sides, maybe unexpected also on both sides. But
Yeah.
I really don't see how the Russians are going to vacate whatever they have acquired easily. And this makes a return to peace and some kind of normalcy, I don't know what, very, very difficult. Because my assessment is that the breakdown in the relationship between the United States, Europe, and on the one hand, and Russia on the other, is very complete. And at the moment, it seems irreconcilable. So we don't know how the two sides are going to get back away from the battleground into the negotiating room. Insofar as Ukraine is concerned, of course, if you compare Ukrainian national capacity with Russian national capacity, they are mismatched. And
Yeah.
Ukraine is paying a much heavier price than Russia. Both are paying a price, but they are paying a much heavier price. Europe is also beginning to hurt today because of many, many reasons. So I would say Europe, Ukraine, and Russia are hurting the most in this uh, last 2 years. Insofar as India is concerned, obviously the impact has been on our economy and on our inflation rates, on prices of energy, and this has spread not just to India but to many, many countries of what now we call the global south. So we would like a return back to normalcy, to going back to peaceful negotiations and the end of hostility, um, because this kind of fracture in the relationship between the two warring sides is also having its contagion effect on everyone else in the world
Yeah.
who are now forced to choose sides, and tempers are still running high, and sanctions are very much in place. Um, so, all in all, this is leading to geopolitical divisions, to fragmentation of the economy, of the global economy, etc.
Now, Putin has made clear that if tomorrow, I mean, he's open to seizure of hostilities and all that, it has to be on his terms. Do you believe that, given how the war is going, um, uh, the scope for outright victory, and how do you define that? The scope for outright victory by either side is not there, or the Russians have got what they wanted. You mentioned that.
The definition of victory and the definition of outright victory is highly subjective. And it depends, which
Yeah.
of the two sides you ask for. Obviously, the Ukrainians want a return to status quo. I mean, they want a return, they want the expulsion of every single Russian soldier and every inch of their territory back. And they wouldn't regard that as victory. They would just say that, this is what is the fundamental principle of international law to protect integrity of territory and sovereignty. Insofar as the Russians are concerned, again, it is subjective. I mean, today they are obviously, in my opinion, successful in achieving the aims, territorially speaking, which they perhaps set out to do. And whether all these gains which they seem to have made are going to sustain over the next few years is the biggest question, and whether what will be the nature of the post hot war scenario. Are we going to see a low level conflict in the occupied territories? Although the Russians don't call it occupied, they say now this is a part of Russia because the constitution was amended within a few days of the breakout last year. So, what is going
Yeah.
to be the situation on the ground in terms of what, let's say, the Ukrainians would call resistance and trying to get the Russians out, and what the Russians might call defending their motherland? So I see the next few years again being difficult in terms of the ground situation. As I said, there is a lot of bitterness. It's going to be very difficult and it will take time for healing on both sides, particularly in the Ukrainian side. Um, uh, but in terms of staying power, from a national power point of view, I mean, which of the two parties has greater staying capacity? Obviously, I think the Russians would prevail because they are a larger economy, larger military power. And we must never forget that the Russian military doctrines, capabilities, and everything else that they've done for the last many decades was not to fight the Ukraine, was to fight NATO. So, and
Yeah.
that is the most powerful military bloc and alliance in the world. So, we should move from the assumption that the Russians are not using everything that they have, in militarily speaking.
Yeah.
I mean, everything they've done to prepare themselves has been to fight a war with the NATO. I mean, that's what actually the Russian military is all about. So, I would say that they would have an upper hand in the medium to long term. The longer this goes on, the more they will entrench themselves, and the more there will be fatigue in Europe. And of course, the US elections are coming up, so it is quite possible that a change in the White House could lead to change in US policy towards the conflict.
Mhm. And Western limitations have been exposed.
Western limitations, yes, because they are democratic countries, there is public opinion. They have an agenda to safeguard their economic living standards, safeguard energy security, safeguard, the engines of innovation, investment, and everything else. And all that has deeply suffered because of the conflict. And Europe has been the worst hit, starting from Germany to other countries. So they would obviously want to get back into uh, the business of improving economic prosperity,
Yeah.
addressing social and cultural problems which are getting increasingly severe because one feeds the other. Plus, they have the migration from outside Europe entering in. They have social tensions now also because of the Hamas conflict. So they have multiple challenges. The United States also is doing well, reasonably well, I'm told, economically. But nevertheless, there is fragmentation of the global economy, which
Yeah.
is hurting everyone. So I think all sides, are hoping. And then besides, also, the fact is that the European countries for the last many years had actually begun to pay less attention to defense preparedness and the militarization of their economies compared to how they were positioned after the Second World War. So there was a
Yeah.
progressive, particularly after the breakup of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet threat had disappeared, they had actually started to, let us say, demilitarize. Now there is a kind of a bit of a resurgence, but that cycle also will take time because this is
Yeah.
the nature of the whole industry and the nature of the game.
Kind of tells you that India has played its cards in Ukraine pretty well, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, what you're saying is true. I mean, we just wish we didn't have to play these cards at all. I mean, that everyone in the global south and the world feels that this should never have happened in the first place. So I think what
Yeah.
we tried to do was to make the best of a very bad situation. And what we tried to do is to maintain our relations traditionally with both sides. And in fact, the irony is that we have good relations with both sides
Yeah.
in different fashions, in different ways. But the
Yeah.
relationships are extremely deep, both with Europe, with the United States, on the one hand, with Russia on the other. So, and obviously, since we are more integrated with the world today than we were, let's say, in the 50s and 60s, the stakes are much higher. So in these
Mm.
circumstances, I think India did a great job in trying to understand the conflict in all its ramifications. Like we discussed, these are very complex, multi-layered historical conflicts with deep grievances, deep suspicions. They're not easy to solve because if it had been
Yeah.
so easy to solve, we wouldn't have reached where we have today. So understanding the complexity it by itself is a big challenge. And I think India did that very well. And which is why we took the kind of positions we took. And I think in retrospect, a lot of the world is now veering around to the positions that India took and understanding
Yeah.
why India took the position that it did. And it is increasingly getting recognized not as the lone voice in the globe, in the international stage, but perhaps as the mainstream sensible view, because even there are voices from within the two sides calling for the need for dialogue and return back. So yeah, I think we've done well.
Mhm. Let's come to India Russia bilateral issues. Rupee ruble. Do you get a sense that we are still stuck on that issue, not knowing what to do with all those Russian monies piled up here?
So this problem began just after 2014 with the first wave of the US sanctions and European
Yeah.
sanctions after Crimea. And that's when we had to go back to the drawing board to see, because that's when the first disruptions began to take place in terms of uh, the banking channels, SWIFT payment networks, etc. And then we had the CAXA law that was passed by the US
Yeah.
Congress. So we've now been dealing with it for, let's say, 5, 6 years or more, let's say since 2015, 16. And what has happened, what has aggravated the problem is that in the last 2 years, there has been a surge in our oil imports from Russia. And as a result, the Russians are sitting on a huge pile of payments due from India, and we are
Yeah.
not able to pay those payments in hard currency. So effectively, the payments are being made in rupees, and the question of utilization is actually today a very serious one. I
Yeah.
know
Mm.
there are different solutions being discussed to somehow facilitate this the payments, but it's not going to be easy. There will have to be some unorthodox and bold decisions by both sides, particularly from the
Mm.
Russians, because if they want to utilize the excess surplus rupee holding, then either they increase their imports from India. So we need to find things that they can buy from us, or we can export to them,
Yeah.
or they invest this stock of rupees into India, and
Yeah.
that also is a option that is being considered. And again, there are multiple options. Or I've heard also the possibility of investing this stock of rupees in third countries. So we'll see. I mean, there are more banks, Russian banks have opened in India with a view to, facilitating transfer of payments to Russia, bypassing the SWIFT, but without
Yeah.
violating the sanctions. So I think this is very much work in progress. But
Mhm.
the solution would be if we can increase our own exports and so that we balance the trade.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm. There's again talk of the Indo-Eurasian FTA. It's been on the cards for some time, never got off the ground.
Yeah, look, I'm not very optimistic or hopeful because if you look at the five, there are five of them in the Eurasian
Mm.
Economic Union. Russia is the biggest.
Yeah.
Then you have Kazakhstan, Armenia, Belarus, Kyrgyzia. So these are the other four. So the smaller
Yeah.
members, and it's also a relatively new organization. So the smaller members are very concerned and somewhat uh, afraid of the Indian market and what this might mean for their own domestic economies. So
I see.
yeah, so there is a fear among them about the free trade agreement actually opening their economies to Indian exports. It's it's not a valid fear, but there is that fear. So some of the smaller
Yeah.
members have actually not been very enthusiastic about an FTA. So they are negotiating. They have one with Vietnam, which is a very low ambition agreement. They have one with China again, which is just like a more of a framework. There are no special dispensations in terms of tariffs, etc. It's just a framework of trade. So they haven't really succeeded in having what you would call a genuine free trade agreement with any country. They're negotiating with one or two others, Iran, Singapore, etc. So I think with India, it is going to take some time. I and also the volume of our trade with these countries is not very high. That's
Yeah, very him.
It's low. I mean,
Uh, there's the issue of nuclear power cooperation on Kudankulam. I understand they're going to build more reactors.
I look. I mean, what we are currently focused on is the 6 units in Kudankulam of 1,000
Yeah,
megawatts
yeah.
each. So Unit 1, Unit 2 are operational. 3 and 4 are at a very, very
Being under
advanced
construction.
stage. Yeah, I think they were talking about commissioning by last year or by this 2024. And then 5 and 6 also construction has begun. So I think right now the focus is on just completing these first 6 units, doing the 6,000 megawatt. And there has been some discussion going on with the Russians for a second site, but we still have to find the appropriate site and get the clearances. So, but right now this is the focus. There has also been some discussion recently of other forms of nuclear cooperation, including what are called small modular reactors, which are
Yeah.
mobile or based on rivers and on the seas and so on. These are smaller in size. But I think right now the primary focus of both is to finish Kudankulam. That is really important because you want to maintain the cost at a low level so that you can sell the electricity at an affordable rate to the consumers, and you want to control your per megawatt cost of construction because there has been cost escalation. And we also have our own very ambitious domestic nuclear energy program, so that also is going on in parallel.
So there's a lot on the bilateral roadmap. I just want to ask you one last question about why a meeting hasn't taken place between Modi and Putin. It was due. It hasn't happened.
Yeah, so I think it's just a set of circumstances which seem to have prevented it. I mean, last year, obviously, President Putin, was completely preoccupied with the Ukraine issue, and he also
Yeah.
did not go to Bali for the G20. And I think that was a year in which the Russians were completely preoccupied with their own regional situation, which was extraordinary in a certain sense. This year, India was preoccupied with the G20. We had invited President Putin. He could not come for reasons which the Russians would best know, but he was invited. Everyone else came. So I think we had these opportunities, but they were not taken, they were not used. But there were other multilateral groupings which met and so on. I read during the minister's visit that they've agreed to have the next annual or the next bilateral summit in this year, 2024, and I'm sure it will happen. So I think it was just a collection of circumstances. It's unfortunate because we have a system of annual summits
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
Russia, but there were other meetings on the sidelines which happened. I mean, he couldn't, for example, go to the BRICS summit in South Africa. So that also did not.
Yeah. There were
It
issues
could
there.
have given an opportunity. So, for various circumstances, partly because of Russia's own situation, this could not happen.
So there's a lot there on the bilateral agenda, and we've covered a fair bit of ground on the issues before us. Clearly, no solutions. Solutions are being looked at, whether it comes to rupee ruble, but clearly it may not be that easy to push something through. Ambassador Saran, thank you very much for your
Thank you.
insight and your perspective on the on Jaishankar's visit. We'll have more as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me, Surya. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Bye bye.
And that's all we have for you on this edition of The Gist. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media. Looking forward to doing more such programs in the new year. Thank you very much. Good night.